Hello, everybody. Welcome to Room and Board. I'm Zachary Groombridge. This is the second meeting of the Rule Book Club. It's the book club, the rules. In this show, we're going to read, review all kinds of tabletop role-playing games, war games, skirmish games, any kind of game that just exists as a rule book. We're going to read it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to discuss it. And this month, we're talking about Rogue Trader, the tabletop role-playing game by Fantasy Flight Games, set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And I've just finished reading this book, and I hope you've been reading this book. And it's an interesting read. It's got a very dense way. It's got dense prose. It's a very over full book, it feels like. And I think the biggest takeaway I have after reading it, it's been a long time since I've read this rule book. I used to play this game quite a bit. Is how I really feel how dated the game is. It is very much a tabletop role-playing game from 2009. If you know anything about tabletop role-playing games, I believe that was the year that 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons came out. It was the year after Pathfinder came out. And it really feels like it is from those early days of tabletop role-playing sort of writing and construction. A lot of the really formative game systems that have come out in recent years that I think have changed tabletop role-playing game rulebook writing and tabletop role-playing games in general, those games had not come out yet, right? We hadn't seen any Apocalypse World systems. We hadn't seen Fate. We hadn't seen, all kinds of things like that. And I think it leaves Rogue Trader in a really interesting place where there's a ton of really interesting, great ideas. There's a ton in this book that's really exciting. Reading this book again made me really want to play it all over again, made me want to find a group. Even as I was reading it and thinking, oh, this is so dated, oh, this is so overcomplicated, oh, this is so inelegantly stitched together, it was really making me excited to play games in this world, this sort of setting, using the rules and systems that are in here, as flawed as they might be. Yeah, it's an interesting book. I'm really eager to hear what any of you who read along or who played this game back in the day, what you guys thought of it. I think the best way for those who didn't read along to start our review is for me to try to pitch this game. And I think it's going to be a little difficult. So if you were a player and I was the GM and I came up to you and I wanted you to play this game, how would I pitch it? And I think the reason this is a little difficult is because I don't think the game makes a very strong pitch for itself. It's a little uncertain in its writing, it's a little uncertain in its construction and its layout, and I think it's uncertain about what the game really is about. So let's see if I can do it. After millions and millions of years of war, the galaxy has become a dark and terrible and grim place. Humanity has taken over the galaxy, but for 10,000 years their empire has crumbled and degraded and consumed itself. There is war on all sides. Aliens of terrifying and evil disposition are clawing at every border. Demons are hungrily devouring souls. Witches and heretics and cults and civil war and division is rife everywhere. The uncountable trillions of members of humanity have given up all of their freedoms in the hope, in the dream of having just some semblance of safety in their lives. It is a terrible, terrible future to imagine and to live in. But you aren't the uncountable hordes of humanity. You're a rogue trader. Your job is to go out to the borderlands, to the fringes, to the unexplored frontier, and to stake a claim. While everyone else has given up their freedom in the exchange for safety, you've given up all hope of safety in exchange for real freedom. The freedom to pursue your ambitions and your dreams, to claim wealth unimaginable, to rediscover secrets thought long lost forever, to learn new things in a universe that hates learning new things, to discover, to explore, to stake your claim, to make your mark on history before you crumble to dust. Because in the grim, dark future of the 41st millennium, there is only war. There is no peace amongst the stars. There is only struggle. And you, as a rogue trader, are in a place to struggle towards something greater than most. So reach out for it, rogue trader, before you crumble to dust and hear the whispered laughter of thirsting gods. Was that a good pitch? It feels like a good pitch. It feels like a better pitch than this game really sets out to make for you. In this game, you're going to be playing the crew of a city-sized spaceship with tens of thousands of crew. You're going to be exploring the unexplored tracts of space. You're going to be exploring new planets, finding new civilizations, trading with them or destroying them. And your goal is to become as rich as possible, to set a really lofty ambition and to strive for it. There's going to be space combat with giant ships, hand-to-hand combat with swords and pistols and rifles. There's going to be political shenanigans. There's going to be exploration. There's going to be investigations, mystery plot lines. You're going to be hobnobbing with galactic governors and high admirals and all kinds of members of nobility. You start this game as a rogue trader able to buy moons and planets, fund armies. The scale of this game is really sort of exciting and huge. And I think the biggest weakness for this game, apart from the writing and a lot of the sort of like confusion with the rules, is that it is a Warhammer 40,000 game. It's set in that setting. I don't know if you just noticed, but when I was trying to figure out how to pitch it, and I pitched the game to you, I really actually was sort of explaining a lot of what the setting of Warhammer 40,000 is. I wasn't really talking about sailing your spaceship around or getting into fights or having politics. I was trying to give you the briefest rundown possible of the setting so I could place a rogue trader within it. And I think that is going to be a great segue into our first pillar of discussion. What conversation does this game actually want you to have? And my argument is, and I think it's clear from reading it, if you've gone through this book at all, that the game wants you to talk about Warhammer 40,000. And it engages with a long tradition, a Warhammer 40,000 oral tradition. I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent for a second. If you were getting into the Warhammer 40,000 tabletop war game, right, you get a 300-400 page rule book. And about half of that rule book is rules to play the game. About half of it is a primer to the Warhammer 40,000 setting. It'll give you a timeline of events. It'll mention things like the Istvan drop site massacre or the Third War for Armageddon, or it'll mention characters like Guilliman or Dante or Trajan the Infinite. And it won't really go into any significant detail about it. It'll mention these events, these people, these places, these things in passing as part of a primer for the setting. And if you decide to really get into it, you'll pick one of the armies that you could play in that war game, and you'll buy a whole nother rule book, another 300-400 page rule book. And about half of that rule book will be rules to play that specific army, and half of it will be detailed lore setting information about that faction, about that army. And in that detailed faction description, it'll start mentioning names that you heard in the core rule book and expanding on them. You'll learn more about what the Istvan drop site massacre was. Maybe your rule book really digs into a lot of who Guilliman is and what his deal is and what he wants. And this is interesting, because when you finally go to play the game and you arrive at the game store or your friend's garage or whatever, and you pull out your armor and you put it on the table, it's a war game. It takes a long time. I think it's 3 or 4 hours a lot of the time to play this game. And it's a 2-player game. So in a 3-hour game, there's an hour and a half where you're standing there watching your opponent take his turn. There's a lot of time where you're just sort of hanging out. And when you're just hanging out with people, watching your opponent take their turn, you talk about stuff. You talk about your commute. You talk about your most recent hobby project. You talk about books you've read, and you talk mostly, it feels like to me, at least from my experience, you talk about the setting of Warhammer 40,000, because you have two 400-page books that you've read full of lore information. And because your opponent most likely has a different faction, they have different books with different lore information in them. And events that have been mentioned in your rule books are expanded on in his, and things that he doesn't know anything about, but he knows a name, or he knows of a situation vaguely. You have the detailed rundown on. And so it creates this sort of environment where everyone is constantly talking about and sharing the information that they've read in their books, because no one is going out to buy all 25 faction rule books for like $100 each, you know what I mean? And to add on to this sort of oral tradition, this retelling of the stories of Warhammer 40,000, this culture, you have, big novels come out every year. I think there's I wouldn't be surprised if there was 10 or 12 big, 1,000-page novels come out every year set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And no one reads all of them. A lot of people read one or two. They'll pick a character they like. They'll pick a book that's about their faction that they play in the war game. They'll read that. And that's just more information that gets shared when you hang out with people who are aware of the setting or interested in it. And this cycle of rule books and novels coming out has been going on for 9 editions. I think the 10th edition of that war game is coming out this year. And that means there's this huge breadth of knowledge about this setting that can only be accessed if you were playing the war game at that point in time. 5 years, 10 years ago, when they were on, 6th or 7th edition of the war game, you had rule books with lore in them that you can't really find or get anymore without going and just talking to someone who played the game at that time. And then you need to get all of the lore. You're going to need to talk to someone who played all of the different factions back at that time. And so there's this tradition of people just talking about the Warhammer setting as a way to engage with it, as almost the primary way to engage with it. You talk to people about it. I wouldn't be surprised if in the comments below this video, a lot of people just are talking about Warhammer, just sharing anecdotes, asking questions, getting those answered incredibly detailed ways. And this is a Warhammer 40,000 rulebook in the tradition of all of those past rulebooks. There is an enormous amount of lore. You see how dense the text is in this game. A lot of this is not rules. A lot of this stuff is just really detailed setting information about the system, about the setting. And something that makes this game particularly fit into the sort of oral tradition is where all of the Warhammer wargaming rule books are about factions at war, because it's a war game. Most of the Fantasy Flight tabletop role-playing game books are about daily life, right? This rule book's all about space pirates and traders, and nobility, and exploring unconquered planets. And it's a view of the setting that you don't get very clearly in any other part. You learn about everyday life on just everyday planets. You learn about law enforcement, about the Navy, about all kinds of these things that you don't aspects of the lore, the world, the setting that you don't get in the traditional way that you engage with this setting. And so Rogue Trader becomes a book full of really tasty information to add to that oral tradition. And you can tell if we go up to the back of the book and we look at the character sheet, which is a great, I think, sounding rod for figuring out what a game is really about. The character sheet is full of skills that are giving you knowledge about the setting of Warhammer 40,000. And the reason you have so many skills that tell you what you know is because you're going to be playing this game probably with a bunch of players that know a ton about Warhammer 40,000. And these skills, these rules about what your character actually knows, this very detailed lore system, is to stop those players from just talking about what they know constantly. You know what I mean? And it serves a dual purpose of, if you're playing with someone who doesn't know anything about Warhammer 40,000, they can pick one of these skills and roll some dice and look to the other players around the table and say, please tell me about this aspect of the setting, because I don't know. But I think the real reason that most of these skills are here are to control how people are really talking about the setting while they talk about the setting in this game. Every single paragraph in this book, whether it's about rules or not, starts with this really detailed fictional placement, right? If you read about how to shoot a gun, it doesn't start being like, this is how you shoot a gun, these are the dice you roll. It starts talking about guns in the universe, right? And on the one hand, that makes it for really interesting sort of world building, right? If you're interested in Warhammer 40,000 as setting, you go, oh yeah, that's good, tasty stuff. But then the rules will be hidden within those big paragraphs of text, and you have to sort of go digging for them. And sometimes the rules will be at the very bottom of a paragraph. Sometimes they'll be in the middle. Sometimes they'll be spread out. Sometimes it'll be on a completely different page, even though you're reading about it right now. The game really wants you to just talk about Warhammer 40,000. And I think, as far as this book goes, I think a lot of people could buy this book if you can still find it. I think you can get the PDF and read through the whole thing and be very contented without ever having any interest in actually playing this as a tabletop role-playing game, because it is just so full of cool stuff for people that are interested in Warhammer 40,000. But let's talk about it as a tabletop role-playing game book. Let's move away from our first pillar, because I think I've nailed that down. I think this game really just wants you to talk about the setting. And I think that's what most of your conversations around the table will be. You and your friends chatting about Warhammer, sharing anecdotes, going to places to explore things that are interesting, that interest all the players around the table already about the setting. And I think the authors aren't fully aware that that's what they've made a game that's about that. But the game, I think, does support that pretty well. If we're going to give this a pass or fail, does this game support the conversation that the game is about? I think we give it a pass. I think it's a very slim pass, because I think this game suffers from being unfocused. But it is focused enough on its setting that I think it succeeds at that first pillar of review. So let's talk about our second pillar of review, the setting itself. And we'll make this pretty short, because we've talked about the setting a lot already in the first pillar. But the art in this book is pretty darn good. And the layout of the book, rule-wise, is terrible. But you can see every page is stylized. It all looks sort of like you've been handed a readout on a clipboard on a spaceship. And that's like really, like, that is the intent. The book is full of all of this art. And I think it leverages, I didn't play the Warhammer 40,000 war game in a lot of past editions. I only really got into it in 9th. But I think this book leverages a lot of the art from past editions of the war game and jams it in here. And what that means is there's a lot of really excellent art in this book, but it's all really sort of disjointed. It's not all from the same source. So if you look here, you get these are almost comic booky splash pages and art that I think was made specifically for Rogue Trader, this rule book. And it's got a very definite style to it. And then on the same page even, you'll get these classic bits of art from John Blanche, who's this famous artist that really started to do a lot of work for Warhammer. And the aesthetic is like so completely different between these two. And you'll also get stuff like this, which looks like a digital painting, but it has someone's like face photoshopped onto the torso, and it looks so cheap in a way. And like no real knocks to this artist, but it does stand out in a very strange way. I wonder if this face is the face of one of the designers that was photoshopped onto this body. I don't know, but that's what it feels like. Yeah, but there's like a ton of really, really great art. It really pushes you into the setting quite a lot. it shows you like the grand scale of things. It's always constantly reminding you of that. Besides the art and just the page layout, which I think is like just really evocative of the setting, every single paragraph, every single section about every kind of rule will begin with a blurb in italics, a quote from someone. Here, let me just look for a good example. So every like little section under a heading in this book will begin not with the rules explanation, not with like this sort of dense prose about the setting. It always begins with this little quote in italics from someone in universe. And some of them are really poorly written. Some of them are really excellently written. But I love this addition to the game because when you're reading through a tabletop role-playing game book and you're a player, you're trying to figure out how people communicate, how they talk in this setting, right? Because you're going to be role-playing, you're going to be pretending to be a person from this world. And when it comes to traditional fantasy settings, a lot of people have sort of a preconceived idea, right? A preconceived idea of how dwarves talk or what have you. You don't necessarily have that for the Warhammer 40,000 setting because it's so specific. And because there's all of this essentially dialogue from characters in the setting throughout the book in front of every section, you really get an idea of how different kinds of people talk. You get, because every little quote from an in-world quote says who made the quote, you get an idea of what people from different walks of life, what they find important. You get an idea, because all of these quotes also use a lot of the terminology from the setting. You really start to quickly get a grasp of what these words mean by seeing them used in context. And I think that's super useful as a player trying to learn how to roleplay in this world. And it's just sort of an incidental thing woven through the entire book. I think it's super useful as a GM as well, because you're going to be role-playing as NPCs, non-player characters. I think it's super interesting just as a thing to open up. While this has been sitting on my table for the last month, I've opened it up a bunch and not read the actual like paragraph texts. I've read like just the quotes, and the quotes are full of so much zhuzh. They're so exciting. They leave you wanting. They give you a little taste of the setting, a little taste of someone's personality and character, and most of them in the grand tradition of tabletop role-playing game writing end in a hook. Right? You could take most of the quotes from this game in this book and spin them out into a whole adventure, which I think is a good thing. A tabletop role-playing game that's really well written, and I don't know if this is really well written, but it does some really good things. You can pick it up and pick a page and read something and get inspired for your next game. And that's what this book absolutely does. So I think the setting is really strong in this book. The art is pretty good. It's not amazing, it's pretty good. The writing is rough, but where it really counts and where it really counts to push forward the setting, it's great. And just like I was saying with the big tabletop wargaming books, about half of them are rules and about half of them are setting. After you get about halfway through this book, it stops being about the rules and just starts to be information about setting, telling you about planets, telling you about factions, telling you about organizations you're going to bump into. And that is the best written and most interesting part of this book. And so I have to give it a pass for the setting, because it knows that that's its biggest strength and that's what it's most interested in. Cool. So setting aside, let's talk about mechanics, because here's where things get slippery, slidey, slimy. This game has a ton of mechanical systems designed to deal with a ton of different situations because the scale of this game is just so broad, right? In a more simple game like Dungeons & Dragons, you have a really clear sort of gameplay loop where you go to town, you get a mission, you go to a dungeon, you explore this area. Dungeons are always sort of built, they're like the perfect little obstacle courses that use a very specific set of mechanics to use them. It's like the perfect environment to use the rules of Dungeons and Dragons because it's made for Dungeons and Dragons. You leave the little dungeon, you go back to town, you rinse, wash, and repeat this cycle. Rogue Trader doesn't have that structure, and it really, really sort of struggles in the face of the big open possibility space that leaves. You're just spacefarers going into the unknown, and you could find anything, right? So first, let's talk about the character building rules in this game. It's obtuse, to say the least. There's this really cool idea in this game called life paths, right? And there's a big page. You pick what your home world was, and when you pick your home world, you then have two options for what you did next in your life. You pick what drove you to the stars, what made you become a spacefarer, what terrible thing happened in your past, what sort of dark secret do you have, and at the bottom of this pyramid of choices, you get to choose your career. And on the surface, it seems like such a cool, interesting way to build a character, where you sort of build their life history up to the point that the game starts. In practice, it really struggles. It really makes the system rough, because it is combining all the Warhammer 40k lore. You build a big backstory for yourself, and the rules for building your character, and it meshes them together in such an... You can't pull them apart from each other. You'll be going through this book, and you'll be building a character, and you'll find yourself slogging through pages of detailed setting information, trying to pick out the special rules that you've gotten. You choose, I started at Death World. And then you go to the Death World page and you start reading through, and it's giving you lore and information about what it was like to live on a Death World. And then you'll get a little hint about a rule that you get to add to your character sheet, but then it'll talk about lore again, and it'll give you some more rules and maybe some more rules. And it really just makes, and you have to do this for every step along your life path pyramid, and it just feels so obtuse and difficult to get through. Really exciting for all of the lore stuff. And it's really exciting that you're getting all of these skills and talents and abilities that are tied into the history of your character that you're creating as you go down this system. Oh man. But it's just so dense. And while you're doing it, you're kind of hoping to yourself, I hope I never get to have to do this again. And once again, pulling the setting into the system, I think it's a great way to bring a new character in, or a new person new to the setting in, because they have to read all of this setting information about who they were and where they came from before they really get their character. But man, as a reference book, terrible to reference the rules. When we get to skills, there's a million skills in this game, and they have such specific uses. The chart goes on for, I think, 4 pages in the book. So many skills. You get your skills, and you're like, okay, never have to deal with that again. And then you get to the talents page, which is even huger. I think there's like an entire chapter of this book that's just talents. And sometimes they're combat abilities, sometimes they're not. Character building is just such a difficult proposition. It will take you probably an hour, maybe 2 hours to build a character. And that can be a big problem in a tabletop role-playing game, because if it takes you 1-2 hours to make a character, it becomes really hard to kill those characters in the game, right? A lot of role-playing games where you're intended to die, making a character is really fast. Like, roll 3 dice, you have your whole character. Rogue Trader is a really gritty, deadly system. It wants you to die. It wants you to feel in danger. But there's this whole, every time you are threatened with death, you have to go back to this really awful character building system to build a character. And I guess that cranks up the stakes of getting killed, makes you want to be more careful with your character. But man, it's rough though, right? You want to build characters for this game and then never build them again, right? You want those characters to survive the whole campaign so you never have to engage with that system again. Let's talk about Skirmish Combat. Now, Skirmish Combat is a big part of most tabletop role-playing games. It's a big part of this one. There's chapters and chapters on it. Most of the talents, lots of the skills interact with this specific subsystem, this game within a game. And it's okay. I think it struggles from what a lot of modern tabletop role-playing games or skirmish games with a modern setting do, in that everybody has a gun. Everyone has many guns. Everyone has guns to serve every purpose, and they also have knives, and what guns sort of do to change a skirmish game is all of a sudden everybody can hit everybody from any part of a map, right? You walk into a room and everybody can shoot everybody. And there's a real danger that if you had 5 people fighting 5 people and the other 5 people go first, they all shoot one of your people and kill them. And then 5 people shoot another one of your people and kill them. And it becomes really easy to focus fire on one target, to take one person down at a time, which can feel really bad. In a game like Dungeons and Dragons, you can move a party into a big empty room, and it's not a big tactical problem because everybody sort of pairs off in their own little fights, locking down different people. You can't really do that in Rogue Trader or in any game where like pistols are a common thing and where they're as deadly as they are in Rogue Trader. So I don't think the tactical skirmish combat is bad, but it definitely requires you to do much more map building as a GM. You need to really make interesting spaces for those skirmish fights to happen in order to make them interesting. And I think that's a bigger burden on the GM. Another problem with the skirmish combat is that so much of what you do in combat is tied to these talents and skills, and also these keywords and special abilities that you have. And that's because a lot of these abilities that give you things to do in combat, they have like a title, like Armor of Contempt. And when you hear, oh, this character has Armor of Contempt, you don't really know what that means mechanically. You have to go and reference it. And referencing anything in this book is a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. There's pages and pages of charts in alphabetical order to try to put all of these talents and abilities into some semblance of a referenceable order. But there are it feels like there's hundreds of them, and it's just so hard to reference. So I've played this game, and I know that when you get into skirmish combat, it becomes a bit of a nightmare. But reading it, it feels like it's going to be a nightmare. You go through pages and pages of weapons, for example, all of which have different effects, different ways of interacting, different special rules. All of that stuff's going to have to get referenced as you play the game. Yeah, it's just a little rough. Now, it is exciting as a player to have a lot of these abilities. The abilities are so flavorful, so tied into the setting. There's a talent that lets you just have a pocket of flesh on your body that you can hide anything in. It's so cool. There's so many cool talents in this game, so many cool skills, so many things that give you such weird and specific abilities. The skirmish combat is not bad. It is clunky, it's hard to reference, and I think it's really difficult to build encounters as the GM that use the skirmish combat in this game well. Another huge part of this rulebook is Spaceship Combat. There's a very big, very detailed part of this book about Spaceship Combat. It's excellent. The rules to build your spaceship, so excellent, so flavorful. You get to put different components in your ship. Everybody gets to take different actions as you move your ship around. Here's the problem, though. You can break the Spaceship Combat system. Again, unless you come up with your game master comes up with really interesting ways to set up that combat to create interesting challenges, the actual mechanical spaceship combat system can be broken. I've played with players who have solved the puzzle of the spaceship combat in this game, and that's a thing to be aware of. It's again another big granular system, bunch of rules that are really hard to reference, but it's a really fun sort of tactical game. And it's really interesting how the game finds a way, because really when you have spaceship combat, you have just one ship, right? It's not like skirmish combat where every different character, every different player gets to go run off and do something else. There's just one ship. The rules find a lot of really, really fun and excellent ways for different members of the crew to contribute to this one ship's functioning. Someone takes the role of captain and flies the ship around. Someone can take the role of arms master and coordinate gun teams, firing broadsides, programming missiles. Another player can take command of boarding parties. Another can do navigation. Another can do piloting. Another can maintain the engines. Everyone can do special abilities that cause the ship to perform better or worse in play. I think a lot of people who get into this game really want to dig into the space combat, and that's understandable. I think the thing to remember when you're reading this, when you go through this book, is the space combat is not the focus of the game, right? I've played with people, I've talked to people who went to this game because there was giant ship combat, wanted to play a game all about that. It's not. It's a subsystem in this game. It's meant to be used as a subsystem. You're not meant to focus on it, and you can really feel that when you read through the sort of the weaknesses of that system. Something I think is great about the the space combat in this game is every turn in the space combat is designed to, in the universe, take half an hour. Because it's in space, you're moving across crazy distances. You can have an entire skirmish battle game, people with guns and swords having a skirmish fight, while at the same time you're having a space fight, while at the same time you're doing an investigation. It's really cool the way you can layer these systems together, because every turn in the space combat takes half an hour in universe, and so you can do other stuff between those turns, which I think is it's really cool. Again, we're getting into the bloat of this system. There's all kinds of mechanics for investigation in this game. It's super interesting, but also super granular, takes a lot of time, is not very intuitive. There's exploration rules, same thing. Super granular, super interesting, takes a lot of time. Yeah, all of that stuff. It's repeated in every game system here. They're all super interesting. None of them are strong enough to carry this game by themselves. Right? You couldn't play this Rogue Trader game just as a skirmish game. You couldn't play it just as a space combat game, just as an exploration game. The rules aren't strong enough. You have to really weave these things together. And the rulebook really doesn't make that clear, I don't think. The other big disappointment about the mechanics for this game is that there are no rules to make this into a hex crawl. If you don't know what a hex crawl is, that's where you have a big empty map of a continent or what have you, and the rules for exploring it and moving across that map and discovering things and then going back to a hometown. You would think that would be a hex crawl system would be great for Rogue Trader. Why isn't it in this book, right? It's a game about exploring the unknown reaches of space. There are maps. There are maps of the space you're exploring. It's got a grid. You might think like, oh, there's got to be a way to move across this grid and explore all these different locations marked here. There's no way to do that. There's no exploration of the space system. That is all sort of expected to be done by the game master, right? And I think that is a big weakness of this game. It's so granular and so overcomplicated in so many ways, but it has no rules to do things that you really just want them to do. You want to be able to say, I point the ship spinward, and we're going to sail for 5 months, and we're going to find out where we wind up. But you can't really do that. This leads us to the final part of the mechanics section of this discussion. The game really wants a very competent game master. So much of the weaknesses in this rulebook are intended to be fixed by the game master, right? The way a lot of these systems don't really communicate with each other but could be used in tandem, a lot of that, it falls on the game master to be able to manage that. The weaknesses in the skirmish combat. You need a really good game master to create a situation to make that combat really shine. The weaknesses in the space combat. Again, you need a game master to really both know the space combat system, but also know how to make that situation interesting from a story perspective, to make that into a good part of the game. It takes a good game master to know that none of the systems in this game are completely strong by themselves and need to be used with each other. And that can be very hard. And the game doesn't make that clear. I know because I've played this game. And reading through it, I can see that. I don't know how clear it is to the writers or to the average person who reads this game, just how competent you need a game master for this. This was like the first game that this was one of the first role-playing games that I game mastered. I game mastered this for years, and I wish I could go back and do it again, because I was so inexperienced when I played this game, and I feel much more experienced now. and I know all the mistakes I made when running this game, but the game lets you make those mistakes because it puts so much onus on fixing the game on the game master. So mechanics, I'm gonna give them a fail, right? I think the mechanics are super interesting. I think a lot of them are really good, but it's a game of many subsystems that don't really communicate with each other. That brings us to our final pillar. What is this game good for? How does it want to be used? And I think it really wants to be used as a reference book, right? I think it wants to be used as a setting book. I think that's the best use for this game. But again, reading through this game again, I want to play it. And I think if I did find a group and put it together and started playing this game again, I get disappointed by all of its systems all over again. Right? Like I got disappointed with them rereading this book, then sort of fell in love with the idea of this game. And I think if I got a group together, the same thing would happen. I would fall in love with the game all over again, then fall out of love with the rules and the rule book. Yeah, so it's tough. As a setting book, fantastic. As a role-playing game, riven with strife. I don't know. I'm very glad I read this book again. I had a ton of fun reading it. And again, knowing all the weaknesses about it, I still want to play this game again. And maybe that's a sign of a good game. I don't know. But anyway, that's Rogue Trader. Have I made any sense? Have I been rambling? This video is probably 3 hours long. I don't know. Yeah, I'd love to hear other members of the book club's opinion on it. Because I only have my own. And I hope some of you have been reading along or have an opinion of what I've said. Next month, we're going to be looking at a completely new role-playing, not a role-playing game. We're going to be looking at a brand new rule book called A Billion Suns. It's pop it up there or there, I don't know. But the game's called A Billion Suns. It's a tabletop war game. It's a real thin book. I think it's like 40 pages max. So I think that there'll be a quick discussion. And after that, we need to decide what book we're going to be reading after that. So on Chris's Room and Board's Discord, we're going to be running a poll. I'll post a list of all of the different rule books that we could read for the Rulebook Club, and we'll make a vote over on that Discord. I'll also put a list in the description below this video of the books that are currently on my list. Right now, I want to make it a nice mix of old classic rule books, of newer rule books, and of newer classic rule books that I think have changed sort of the way tabletop role-playing games have worked. And yeah, please let me know if this was interesting at all, if I rambled too much. If you'd never want to see me on Room and Board again, please like and comment below and tell Chris to get me out of here. And if you did enjoy this, like and comment and tell Chris to, I don't know, give me a slice of pizza or something every once in a while. That's everything, everybody. Have a great one.